I'm Gosling. I'm the artistic director of Together 2012 CIC. I'm a white woman with pale olive skin and green eyes behind black plastic glasses. I've got cropped red hennaed hair under a grey trilby, and I'm wearing a grey patterned cardigan, a purple jumper, and silver jewellery. I'm joined today by Mix Dennis Queen, singer-songwriter and general performer, to talk about Holocaust Memorial Day, which falls as it always does on the 27th of January. Holocaust Memorial Day is a very particular day for disabled people around the world, where we remember the approximate, because nobody knows, 250,000 disabled people from all faiths and backgrounds who were murdered by the Nazis. But first, I'm just going to ask Dennis to introduce themselves and provide a bit of audio description.
Hi, I'm Mix Dennis Queen. I am a white glasses wearer. My glasses are pink and black. My hair is growing out of its little man bun right now, so it's starting to look like I've got a bob, but that won't last past the barber visit next week. I'm wearing a navy knitted cardigan that's zipped up high because it's cold.
And it's, yes, we're recording this on a very cold, stormy weekend just before Holocaust Memorial Day. Together 2012 has been taking part in Holocaust Memorial Day since 2020, which was the first time that we really understood there was an opportunity for us as disabled people to come together with all of the other groups affected by the Holocaust and the Nazis. And since then, we've been taking part, supporting the national theme. And this year, we're commemorating 80 years since the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp. So, as an organisation, we've been taking part in a project called 80 Candles for 80 Years. And groups have been invited to create candle holders that commemorate a particular victim of the Nazis or a particular group of victims. And in our case, we've worked with the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust previously to create a digital candle flame, because for obvious reasons, it's difficult for us to promote the lighting of candles in windows by disabled people. So there's now a digital flame available, which anybody can download from the Holocaust Memorial Day website. And you can just display that on your phone, put your phone in the window, but you can also put that logo onto your social media, onto your website, into your Instagram feed. And that's what we'll be doing on the 27th and beyond. So we've designed our candle holder from recycled materials, which are always the basis of what we do in our art clubs. We're very much kind of coming from a home is where the art is. Let's use the materials in our home. And one, I'll come back to some of the description later, but we've used some of the readily available home medication over the counter labels to create this holder for our mobile phone. And then on the mobile phone, next to the digital candle, we have the image of some of the prosthetics and orthotics, the prosthetic legs, arms, and other mobility aids. Well, they're not just mobility aids, and I think that's a really important point to make. They're seen almost as the possessions that were left behind. They're presented within the Auschwitz Museum as some of the possessions that were left behind by all of the victims of the Nazis. But of course, as disabled people and wheelchair users, we know that those are actually body parts. And so many of these body parts were found during the liberation of Auschwitz. And we have a photo given to us by the museum, which we've put online next to the image of the flame. And we'll be displaying that through Holocaust Memorial Day and beyond. There's a link on our website for anybody who wants to find it. But of course, it is distressing. And what we've chosen to use in terms of audio is the sound of a fire, because that reminds us of all of the bodies of disabled people and other groups who were burned. And of course, many of us come from more than one group and therefore have more than one link to the Holocaust. We might be Jewish and disabled, queer and disabled, Black and disabled, Roma. All of these groups were affected by the Nazis. And something that worries me is the number of people who think the Holocaust is nothing to do with them, because it's to do with all of us, because any of us can become disabled at any time. So that's our tribute. And of course, it is distressing. And I should say at this point, the whole of the content of this podcast is inevitably distressing. And I would definitely issue a trigger warning. Please don't listen further if you don't feel strong enough to cope with it at this particular moment, because it's a very, I think it's more difficult because we haven't been taught about it. I don't know what you think about that, Dennis.
Yeah. Inevitably, there'll be people tuning into the podcast who may be hearing this for the first time, and it's surprising. It's very upsetting. It's very sad, and that is because I don't think we're really educated about it. Until I was in the disabled people's movement, I hadn't ever heard that there were any groups affected other than Jewish people as a whole. Certainly until I was involved in activism with other disabled people, I hadn't really heard that other groups had been specifically targeted in the way that LGBT people had been targeted, in the way disabled people, and particularly in the beginning, disabled children have been targeted. And I think that is a real problem.
And I think one of the things that is so striking is that it started with disabled people. And on the bottom of our candle holder, we've written, first, they came for disabled people. And that program started with forced sterilisation. And this covers all groups of disabled people. This was certainly very much a social model approach. It didn't matter whether you had learning difficulties, mental health difficulties, long-term health conditions, physical impairments that affect your mobility, visual impairment, hearing impairment. All of those groups were targeted right from the beginning, first with forced sterilisation, and then in 1939, the T4 so-called euthanasia program started. But of course, we would see it for what it is, which is a mass murder program. And I think we fail to be educated about the fact that all of these things started with disabled people, including gassing. So they moved on from lethal injections and barbiturate overdoses to the infamous showers in concentration camps, where people thought they were going to go in for a shower, and in fact they were gassed. And all of that started solely with disabled people before it was moved to other groups. And yet at the same time, as the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust say on their website, there's very, very little known about those disabled people. Many of their families were lied to. They didn't realize that they'd been killed. They were told that they died of pneumonia, they died of some other illness, they'd passed peacefully and naturally. So families had no opportunity to find out what had actually happened to them. But I also fear that there was almost an acceptance that somehow it mattered less. And, we see that now. Why are we not taught that 250,000 disabled people died? Well, somehow that doesn't seem to matter as much.
And the understanding as well how it connects back to today, and that many of the attitudes that we have, or society has, about disabled people come from these origins, and also that going even further back, the origins of the theory behind why they're doing this aren't just German. So I think that's really important too, to understand the position and uh, how people in Britain helped create the politics that then led to what the Nazis did.
Well, absolutely. This was all seen as very scientific, and that started in the UK, but also the US. And I think people are very ignorant about the forced sterilization programs in the US and the links that were made between racehorses and human beings. That it was seen as, what you would do to improve the stock of racehorses was also seen as what you did to improve the stock of human beings. And just as poor people were seen as genetically inferior, people, under those theories, which of course still hold a lot of sway today, people are not poor because of their circumstances. They're poor because they're genetically inferior. They're bound to be poor. They're bound to be criminal. It's not that they're being denied the opportunities that they need. These are very convenient so-called scientific theories. And having had the privilege of being funded twice by the Wellcome Trust, once to spend 18 months at the National Institute of Medical Research, I'm very aware that, how much today real positive good science is just manipulated by
Mm,
politicians and economists. Science is used in way, is meant to show you things that are actually completely untrue, particularly around human biology. um that's a slight digression, but it's not really, because as you say, all of these attitudes are linked back. And
mm,
the Nazis ran with the ideas that had started in the US and UK.
mm,
And I think, again, we shouldn't be surprised that attitudes towards disabled people can be so negative in the UK today, because generation by generation, we've relearned these
mm,
attitudes. I mean, something that really surprises me as somebody who is interested in all sorts of history is when archaeologists find evidence that disabled people were part of previous communities and were looked after. And there's almost this, oh, but of course, in the wild, people would just, it's survival of the fittest, people would just let it die. And you think, but that's just not true.
mm.
Kindness and compassion and love and care and seeing beyond somebody's body or beyond somebody's mind, absolutely, of course, that's defined us for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. And oh, well, animals, would just leave the other ones to die. Well, certainly what I've witnessed, in my
Oh, they don't.
last years is absolutely the animal. If we had a cat who very sadly became ill and passed after some months last year, and the other cats, one in particular, really, they would cuddle up to it to keep it warm. They would wash it to make sure that its coat was okay. The idea that the rational thing to do, the natural thing to do,
Mm,
is to abandon anybody perceived as weak, is just simply not the case. And yet we act as if it is.
mm,
And I know that, you know, you've been very active in the campaign against assisted suicide. And I think one of the things that really troubles me very deeply about the process that's now going through Parliament is that it's seen as rational to
mm,
want to die rather than to become disabled. And whatever we need to do to improve people's experience of dying, you shouldn't be starting from the basis that you don't have to be ill at all. You just
mm,
at this moment in time, you need diagnosis that you have an underlying illness that's going to kill you within 6 months.
mm.
But then there's an assumption that the rational response is therefore to kill yourself now. And you need
Oh,
to have two doctors in place to make sure that you're definitely going to die within 6 months and you're definitely not being pressured by anybody else. But the
same system as
rational,
the Nazis in the beginning when they started murdering disabled children. They had to have two doctors sign it off, and yet, sorry to interrupt you,
no, no,
and yet, nobody is aware that these exact same things are a lot of the exact same things as were happening during the Nazi um, attack on disabled people. and we're just replicating again and again the exact same process. And in fact, we cannot mention it in assisted suicide related campaigning. We can't even mention it because when we talk about the connection between what we're doing now and the Nazis, we're immediately told that we're just using this device inappropriately, that we're trying to claim ground that's nothing to do with us. And yet, like you say, it began with disabled people. It began with us. Methods were tested and developed on us, and that's
Absolutely.
very
And I
hard.
think, if you have a terminal diagnosis, you might feel fine. Why would, what has made you think that the rational option is to kill yourself straight
Mm,
away? It's a continual, we could talk about the lack of support for good dying, but it's
mm,
also about the continual denigration of disabled people's lives. That if you're lying, and yeah, and how can it be rational? How can suicide ever be a rational response
mm,
in the short term? Like I say, I think there's a whole completely different debate to be had around good deaths and good births, because
yes.
the experience of giving birth in the UK has never been more dangerous. And again, far more dangerous for women of colour, for women from marginalised groups, for disabled women than
Mhm.
it is for other women. But it's not a good system for anybody. But I think this idea that, of course, the sort of normal, natural, and the only people who would think it's not rational are religious people. And this has been coming out over and over again before this bill was passed. Oh, well, you must be religious if you
Yeah.
think it's not rational to kill yourself. The only reason you would want to stay alive when you were disabled by a terminal illness would be because you believed in the sanctity of life and you had no right to terminate it.
Mm.
Otherwise, and again, it's this opposition, isn't it, that religious people are not seen to be rational.
Yep, it's pitched as
You know,
religion
and
against science, but actually, really, religion against sense. And that is the two sides of the argument. Sensible people, they want to die, and then there's religious people, and it's absolute rubbish. People
I think
campaigning
just to
about it. Oh,
clarify, yeah, I mean, just to clarify, I'm not a person of faith. I don't know
mm,
about you, but
yeah,
my very grave concerns about all of these things, do not come from religion. They come from being somebody who's lived with pain, significant pain for over a quarter of a century. I've lived with a completely unrelated brain injury for over a
mm,
quarter of a century. I've been using a wheelchair for more than a quarter of a century. These things are not things that make life worthless,
mm,
and many of my friends, have been at pains to say having somebody else do your personal care is not a reason to die. Of
mm,
course, and I have to say at this point, I'm not having a go at anybody about the choices that they want to make. But I think this political attitude that the rational response to a terminal illness is to just go now.
yeah.
You
And
know,
we're being taught that it's not. It's talked about as if this is just almost we know this in our DNA. And we don't. We're being taught this message again every single day. And that's how young people get it because they relearn it from being told it. And I think that's the hard bit is people don't seem to understand they're being given this belief. It's not just like you say, natural. It's not just a natural consequence. Actually, what's natural, because human beings are programmed to survive, we are programmed to try and thrive, is that nearly everyone is doing everything they can to have every hour, every day they can to be
well,
with their families.
that I mean, that's what I've found, and again, it concerns me that there are people in this world who've never come across, never been friends with anybody who's got a terminal illness, never had a relative with a terminal illness, and also have very exaggerated ideas. Of course, some people die terrible deaths, and we really have to do something about that. But I can also, as a disabled older person, I've lost a lot of people. And generally speaking, well, in fact, most of them have been able to participate and engage with the things that really matter to them. up until days or, at most a fortnight before they've actually passed. What they've been able to do actively has happened for a long time. But I also, I have a relative who was told last August, you have less than 6 months to live. And she was devastated. And she asked for different treatment. And lo and behold, now she's been told she's in remission. It almost becomes, but she, in a couple of years' time or less, she could have just opted to die at that point. She wouldn't have
Yeah.
seen Christmas. She wouldn't be looking forward to next Christmas. So I think there's a huge amount of uncertainty. Some of these things we go, well, how can anybody even be sure? But you
Mm.
can certainly, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it?
Yeah, it
But
is.
I think that all of these people who, as we know, people are just desperate to get extra hours. As
Mm.
you've been saying, people are looking, fighting with the NHS for the right to have a drug that will extend their life by 6 months.
Mm.
I don't, you see a few very middle class, very articulate people spearheading the campaign, saying, surely, if you're a rational person, you must agree with me. But where are all of those people who are saying, please give us access to the drugs that, for example, you can have in Scotland, but not in England, or you can have in England, but not in Wales, or you can have in
Yeah.
Europe, but not in the UK? Where are the voices coming from them? And where are we linking it back to what happened in the Holocaust? We have to be aware of what we're doing. I'll come back now to the Together 2012 candle holder.
Mm.
What we've used in the packaging is packaging from Bayer products. And Bayer, I don't know how you pronounce it in different countries, but it's Bayer. And
Fire in Germany, yeah.
yes, I think it's Bayer in German, but it is a huge multinational. And they make products that all of us have on our shelves, like Alka-Seltzers and Rennies. There's a very popular antihistamine they make. I think we took package. I think we ordered about 6 products on Amazon and took the packaging from those. And the reason we took it is that Bayer well, the first reason is that Bayer developed barbiturates in the late 19th century. And barbiturates were not only the first means of killing people under the Nazis, but it's the standard way for assisted suicide today. If you go to Dignitas, you take a barbiturate overdose. And as I understand it, that's pretty much what's being proposed here. You take the barbiturate overdose. Bayer went on to become part of a bigger company under the Nazis that then also created the chemical gas. They were absolutely fundamental. Bayer were producing all of these products. But today, I think they were basically kind of refloated by the Allies after the Second World War. And today they're in every home. And I looked at their website and they, under a fairly new chief executive, it's only in the last 10 years that they've even been able or started to address this history in the Holocaust. But they're looking at it purely in terms of the use of forced labor. Because, of course, people in concentration camps also worked to create their products. There is nothing on their website to look at
They,
responsibilities to disabled people. I think they should be absolutely questioning and raising
mm,
awareness of where do we get these ideas from, because they're not from lived experience. My lived experience of people with terminal illnesses is that, yes, there are things that really certainly need to be done to create better deaths, but those people haven't wanted to die early.
no.
But I suppose, as a disabled queer person, I have additional concerns. And I think
Mm.
it's really disturbed me as a long time co-chair of Regard, the National LGBTQI plus disabled people's organisation, which is something I do in my so-called spare time. We've been given no access to the committee that's considering the evidence. There is no LGBTQI plus organisation of any kind being called to give evidence to this committee. And I think, again, they would say, well, why does it matter? Well, if you don't know why it matters, you shouldn't have voted for the bill, which most of the people on the committee did. You know, we're in a situation where approximately 1 in 3 in the UK of the queer community, and I'm just using that as an umbrella. I appreciate people don't all connect with it, but LGBTQI plus is a bit of a mouthful to keep repeating. So in terms of the queer community, 1 in 3 of us are disabled, and that's compared to 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 of the general population. And there's a number of reasons for that, but a lot of it relates directly to the experience of discrimination. And that can be very specific, you know, people who've got head injuries, people who are using wheelchairs because they've been physically attacked.
Yeah.
But very often it's about mental illness, it's about self-medicating with alcohol and drugs, which leads to kidney disease, heart disease, higher rates of cancer, you know, right across the board. We have a much higher rate of disability. And when we're disabled, we're much more likely to be dependent on social care, because 70% of LGBTQI plus people don't have children. And actually, that's also true of 70% of disabled people. You know, the difference between us and other disabled people is that so many of us leave the places where we've grown up, because we've, even if we haven't been actively rejected, in order to find a community, in order to find acceptance, people have moved to the cities. And then when you move to the city, the places that you meet people tend to be community venues. People don't tend to meet each other at home. So very often people can have socialized in the queer community for decades, but never been to each other's homes. Because another issue for people inviting people back is that you can almost be outed by your visitors.
Yeah.
Or if you're known to be queer, your visitors are at risk. You know, and over the years, you know, we've often seen situations with social care workers where social care workers are attacked because they're going to queer clients' homes. So these are very real risks. But it means as soon as you can't access the community venue, you fall straight through the net.
Yeah, we
You
can't
know,
access the community venue nearly all the time.
and of course, you know, that's the other reason that Regard campaigns so hard around access and inclusion, because it's when when you need it, your community most is when you need your community most. It shouldn't be the point where you're least able to access it. But for all of these reasons, you have a lot of people who, if they received a terminal diagnosis, are not going to have the support in place that a straight person would have.
And many people have nobody. We have to build, and not everyone can, but many of us build our own families. So, you know, I talk about my rainbow family. I talk about my rainbow nephews and nieces, because we have to be the aunties and the uncles and the uncles and the
Oh,
aunties
that's absolutely
for
right.
those children who don't have extended family anymore, whose parents have been rejected from their communities. Yeah.
Well, that's right. So what you now have is a situation where this parliamentary committee are going to make sure that people aren't unduly influenced to commit suicide. But we're not talking for the queer community. That's not the issue. The issue for the queer community is that people are facing a very lonely death. They're facing a death where you cannot access your community venues. And, you know, over the years, you know, over decades, I've been campaigning and fighting for the right to access things like Pride. And the funders haven't cared. You know, you can go to the funders and the sponsors with a whole list of issues. They don't care. They just don't care. They fund it all anyway. So you have no chance of being included. So you have this group who can't access, you know, have no family support, no access to community support. There's community specific health services and social care services and things closed many years ago. The issue there is not about somebody, a relative putting pressure on you, and that's the only issue that this committee is looking at. I want to know, but I'm not allowed to ask because we're not allowed to speak to them. What
Mm,
are you going to do to make sure that my community does not kill themselves in much greater numbers? Are you even going to monitor the sexual and gender orientation of people who are coming forward?
yeah.
Where is the monitoring going to? Again, I can't ask those questions because we're not being allowed to. And
Mm,
then you have the whole issue of the additional pressures, the body beautiful images, which is an issue for women, but is particularly an issue for gay men. You know,
mm,
gay men can really struggle with things like stomas. You know,
mm.
suddenly you're diagnosed with bowel cancer, but hey, you can go and commit suicide as opposed to negotiate the rest of your life with a stoma. I mean,
Yeah, and it becomes a treatment option. This is the thing I think that I find hardest to swallow, is that this, as it's being designed in the UK, would be part of the healthcare system. So
yes, I
when
mean,
I next end up at A&E because I'm suicidal as a disabled person, for me, on the list of treatment options would be this pathway, where
well,
for other
certainly it
people it
would be.
wouldn't.
It would be if you'd got a diagnosis of less than 6 months to live.
Yeah.
I've known so many people who've done so much with that 6 months, and very often it's turned into years, which again, brings us
Yeah.
back to the fact that this is a very difficult piece of legislation. But
Mm,
I feel that, the other issue for me of grave concern is that suicide rates are considerably higher anyway
yeah.
in the queer community, you know, and there's nothing in what the committee are examining that says, well, how do we actually, what funding are we going to put in to tackle the fact that, again and again and again, I see a report of, the death of a drag queen, the
Yeah.
death of a people who've actually been doing really well, but who are now absorbing so much hate from social media that those messages are being amplified to the fact they don't think they deserve to live. So you have all of these issues, and yet we're not even allowed to bring them up with the committee to say, what are you going to put in the detail of the legislation to stop my community being hit far, far harder? And once it's law, nobody can turn around then and say, well, I think you're just depressed. Or, I think
Mm,
actually if you tried the stoma, you'd find it would be absolutely fine. And, you could go on and you could go and have some happy holidays and do all sorts of different things, get your bucket
mm.
list together. But there's no possibility of a bucket list under this, is there?
No, no,
You
there
know,
isn't.
but like I say, I think, bringing this back to the Holocaust, I find it so offensive that whenever we question this march towards state legalized, state assisted suicide, oh, it has to be about religion. And yet there's no acknowledgement whatsoever that 250,000 people died. Hundreds of thousands more were sterilized. Those sterilization programs have continued
Yeah.
in places like Scandinavia and Japan until really recently. If you look at Japan as a country, the vast majority of people with mental health difficulties are still institutionalized. That's not
Mm,
actually something that's well known, but there's a very famous artist whose name escapes me, but who does dots everywhere and is huge, made huge amounts of money and has just had a very big exhibition in the UK. And she's always described as choosing to live in an institution in Japan. And there's no acknowledgement of the fact that what choice is there, because it's seen as the
yeah.
normal thing to do. If you have mental health difficulties in Japan, you move into an institution. It isn't this kind of, oh, I thought it would really help support my mental health if I went into this therapeutic community. It's kind of, no, it would be
It's
unfit.
just where you go. Yeah,
Exactly. It's just
that's
where
what you
you
do.
go. And we have all of these ideas been sloshing around since, not just the Second World War, of course, the 19th century. And we know rationally, that lovely word, we can see rationally how science has been used over and over again purely for political and economic
Yeah,
reasons.
yeah, and that it's behind a lot of the racism that we still that people still face today. That there's always been that and to some extent these beliefs started with science saying, people are different to each other, and some people are so different they need to be kept separate, or they can be have all their things their entire natural resources taken away, or they can be our property. The concept of people as property has only just gone away in this country, and like
Well,
you say, still happens in
absolutely.
others.
And I think the other thing though is that the science came along to support the ideas. We had
Yeah.
the transatlantic trade in enslaved African peoples for centuries. And when it was being questioned, lo and behold, let's develop the theory of eugenics that says that this is a natural thing to happen.
That's right. And they made it up. They just made it up. It didn't come from some scientific evidence that they had collated somehow. It was
Absolutely.
political.
And when I was at the National Institute of Medical Research, it was so interesting because I thought, well, maybe I've got all these ideas wrong. But no, and you would actually have scientists saying, surely people don't believe such and such. Because, these were people living in a very kind of segregated world of their own, if you like. And my thinking at the time, it was when I was developing the scientific model of disability. And that was very
Mm.
much around the idea that science can cure everything, and that
Yeah.
there's this idea of normal, which is non-disabled, and that we just have to wait a little bit longer and then that's going to happen. And again, it's this
Mm.
idea of rationalism, isn't it, that somehow there's this non-disabled state and that's the only kind of normal rational
It
desire.
is, and that we should all want it. And in fact, so many non-disabled people would be surprised to find out that, still surprised to find out in this day and age, as we say, that lots of disabled people don't see that as our standard, that we don't see that as our ideal. We don't see that as something to aspire to. We might be quite happy being a deaf person. We might be quite happy as we are,
but
or at
also
least we accept it, which is the other thing. We're not supposed to accept it, even if we have it.
But
Mm.
also, it's just as well because science doesn't believe, there isn't a scientist in the world that believes that they're going to cure old age, make everybody live forever, find a cure for everything that happens. In fact, every year that goes by, we discover more that says all of these conditions are natural. And just like I say, just as well, the only ways that science have shown us that we can improve our lifespan are all the things that people don't want to do: stop smoking, stop drinking, exercise more. Well, and actually I have to say young people are doing that much more than my generation. But those things give you 10 or 20 years more healthy life. But science can't. However, as we said, where science can extend life, most people overwhelmingly want that to happen. But
Mm.
but again, for anybody who thinks that, we're not considering people in desperate circumstances, of course we are.
Well, we
What
are.
we
We
do,
disagree about the what ought to be done, and this is when we're campaigning about assisted suicide. One of the things we often say is that we basically, in general, agree about what the problem is. What we don't agree is what we should do about it. And actually, the solution of of helping people kill themselves is not a natural consequence solution. It's not part of natural science. It's something we're being taught. And also, how can they have, you referenced earlier them talking within, themselves within Parliament about coercion, and not understanding that having this bill in itself is a form of coercion, that normalizing this as a concept that we could even think about having is a form of coercion. And it's so ironic, really, that they think they can discuss that as an abstract theory when, in fact, they right now are the biggest influence on that belief. They are creating that belief every day.
well, I think the coercion for me is very much around, and I'm so glad you brought that up because it is something that really, really concerns me. That if you know that there's no social care available when you're ill, if you know that you could die in a hospital corridor, you
Yeah,
know, those things are all coercion.
yeah.
Again, it's this incredibly this, oh well, people might feel worried about losing this, not being able to leave their savings. And you just think, really, how many people do you think in this country have got
Mm,
savings that
exactly.
they're waiting to pass on to their heirs. I'm sure
Yep.
the people who are making the
Exactly.
decisions are in that position, but the rest of us aren't. And I think,
Exactly. It's
again,
completely irrelevant. The protections that they're looking at mainly are just going to protect people who are rich. So what they're looking at is saying if they believe somebody was trying to steal something, then that might be considered problematic. And it's a similar way to how we do it now. And unless that has happened, unless they believe there's been some kind of fraud on that person, none of us, like you say, most of us don't have anything to fraud us for. My children don't have an inheritance to make sure I die early for. These are not the day-to-day issues we deal with, how to deal with our pots and pots of money.
I mean, I do wonder how Parliament or this particular committee thinks you equate the fact of somebody going, well, I do want mum to kill herself, but that's because I've already doing two jobs because
Mm,
universal credit's making me do that. I'm doing two low paid jobs. I've got my own children to look after, and there's no social care for mum. So the best solution all round is for mum to kill herself. You know, where are you then going to put in the social care to stop that moral issue? But I
you
think
just
that
can't, yeah.
the queer people as well, we don't live in the same domestic setups. You know,
No,
our domestic setups are much looser. Many people live with partners they're not married to.
yeah.
So they know that if the council starts, you know, if you own your own home and the council starts providing social care, you know, yes, your married partner may have some rights to stay in that home. It may
Mm,
it may not be considered under the current rules. We don't know what the future rules are going to be in terms of social care contributions. But if your daughter lives with you, or your unmarried partner lives with you, or as is so very common in queer households, your non-related friends who you may or may not once have had a relationship with
yes.
lives with you, none of them have any rights. You know, your
Mm,
home can just be taken away and they can all be made homeless. Now,
yeah.
under those circumstances, of course, somebody's going to go, oh, it's entirely my decision. I just can't bear to think about dying. But what you really mean is, I cannot make my dependents homeless.
Yeah.
You know, but even in terms of savings, if you're saying, well, you know, my child is in a desperate situation and needs what little bit of money I have, and the council is going to take that for social care unless I kill myself. I mean, I find it really disturbing that you have these very self-satisfied, as they come across, MPs going, oh, we've done a wonderful job. We're not bringing in legislation like other countries that requires you to be suffering. Oh, no, you don't have to be suffering at all. You just have to have a terminal diagnosis.
Yeah. You just have to know you might suffer later,
Yeah, or you
probably,
don't need, yeah, or you might
maybe.
not even want to be suffering at all. But you know, where you have this definition of if you're suffering unbearably, you can die, as we've seen in places like Holland and Canada, the definition of unbearable suffering has just expanded and expanded and expanded.
Yeah.
However, you've still got to be suffering. This idea that you can be feeling absolutely fine. And the number of people who've said to me, oh, I've got a terminal diagnosis, but actually I feel fine at the moment. You know, I felt ill before I started the treatment, but I feel
Mm,
absolutely fine at the moment. You know, in Canada, they wouldn't be able to access euthanasia. In Holland, they wouldn't be able to access euthanasia. They'll be able to access it here.
mm.
And again, you know,
Well,
my
the idea is that is to avoid the suffering, and that's like you said earlier. I feel like it's going to become the automatic thing that you know you should do when you get that diagnosis to avoid suffering, and that's the whole. People are so afraid of dying with no help, no, and all of these things that they'd kill. It's crazy, and not in a cool way, like we're crazy. It's they would kill themselves to avoid dying. What is there's no sense in that. And
there,
we should
there
all be able to look forward to a comfortable death.
Well, that's right. And I think, you know, the idea that a successful treatment can shorten your life, I think is something that we would all accept and
Yeah.
welcome. But that's a very, very different thing to taking a barbiturate overdose. you know, and this idea that, oh, people go to Dignitas because they can't make a last minute decision to avoid last minute suffering. But
Mhm.
actually, that's not true at all. You know, people, the law as it's being proposed and implemented will be exactly the same. You know, you
Mm.
won't have to, you know, and are people going to Dignitas early now because they can still get on a plane, or because it's the avoidance of suffering? Nobody's done a survey. You know, God forbid there's been any proper research.
And also people, there are so many myths about why people choose assisted suicide, and this belief that it's about one kind of thing, when actually the main reason that people give is that they feel like a burden. The set like the in general, that's the top of the list of the highest percentage.
And I
And
think the
yeah.
other thing that comes across, and again is seen as rational in the
Mm,
UK, is this idea of control. Now, as a disabled woman, the idea, you know, I've never given birth. It's like, but the idea that you can control your body is just such, it just makes no sense at all. And I
if
remember,
only, eh?
yeah, well, absolutely, but somehow it's seen as this, you know, if we, again, it's part of that scientific model of disability. If we just hang on a little bit longer, science can control everything we do. We've never been able to control our bodies. You
No,
know,
and
that,
death has always been messy. This is the thing, we think we
yeah,
can
Earth is
avoid the
meant to
mess
be,
of death, and we can't, you know?
no, in the same way, indeed, that you can't avoid the but you know, you can give people good treatment when they're giving birth. You can give people good treatment when they're dying, and you can give people treatment that hastens their death. You know,
Yeah.
if that's medically appropriate. You know, but leaving people to die on trolleys. I mean, yes, we lost somebody in 2019 who was, you know, a family member who was very close to us, who died calling for help in a flower bed because the day before they'd been discharged from A&E, despite having all of the signs of heart failure. They were given no treatment, they weren't admitted. You know, they were told they were fine, so they went outside the next day to do their usual Sunday walk up the road to get a paper, just fell into the flower bed outside their home and died calling for help. That is not a good death. You know,
No.
I many years ago I watched my father die because my mother kept phoning and phoning and phoning the GP saying he's had a heart attack, and the GP wouldn't come out. And in
Mm.
those days you couldn't call an ambulance yourself, and we literally had to watch him die. It would never occurred to me that so many years later people are still having such terrible deaths. And
Mm.
all we can do about it is say that for the minority that get medical notice of dying, because most people die in ways that are not predictable,
No.
somehow we won't do anything to give them a good death, but we will let them kill themselves early, you know,
Yeah.
with support. But I think there's a real gender issue here in the disability movement. And I went in 2019 to the Blue Dot Festival, and I was invited to have a discussion and read some poems with a couple of disabled men who I will try to keep nameless in the circumstances. And although we weren't supposed to be talking about assisted dying, the issue of living in pain came up.
Mm.
And what these men were saying is, you know, how can any parent bear to see their child suffering? And I said, well, do you have daughters? Well,
Mm.
yes, what's that got to do with it?
Yeah,
And,
I mean,
and you just think, well, actually, most women have serious pain for several days
mm,
every single month from their early teens until their 40s, 50s, 60s. And that pain, I mean, as speaking as somebody with chronic pain, you know, I've had in my past period pains that were far worse than
mm,
even a spinal fracture. And women are brought up, you don't talk about it, you don't let it impact on you, you don't get prescribed anything. You know, there's every week, it seems, there's more research comes out about the way that women with fibroids are ignored, the way women have to go through years and years and years of agony even to get an appointment. And that's just normal. You know, now we could do
mm,
something about that, but we don't need to, because apparently it's not a problem because it's not connected to a terminal diagnosis. This is something you've just got to live with month in, month out, you
mm.
know, for decades. And we just take it for granted. And I think there's, and one of the things we don't do is talk to our fathers about it. So
No.
You have
But they don't even do it. Those of them in the positions where they could be doing something about it, historically at least, they don't even know.
And
Yeah.
then they have this real moral dilemma. Oh, for example, they've had a child and that child is going to have some temporary suffering because they've got to go through surgeries. Oh, should I have had this child at all? Should I just let this child die? And you think
Mm.
if this child lives a healthy life and it's a woman, it's a female child rather,
Mm.
that child can expect to go through silent agony for many, many years. So, we have this very strange gendered attitude to pain, which I have to say
Mm.
I've noticed myself that, if I've had a brother-in-law, for example, who's hurt their shoulder playing golf, they've got far more attention than
Oh,
somebody
yeah,
with underlying
men's
condition.
pain matters. That's what we've all learned, at least
Yeah,
those of us who are old fogies. Men's
and
pain matters.
and I, all of my male friends, I do apologize about this, but the reality, we're talking about the medical system. We're not talking about you.
Yeah,
But yeah, the medical system response to a pulled muscle from golf is very, very different to the medical response to somebody with appalling pain from fibroids. But
yeah, yeah.
it,
And,
but
like, people don't mention that these pains, these period pains that women and other people with the womb have, these these are the same as the contractions you have when you're giving birth. It is the same motion, it is the same thing, and even but we never talk about that. We don't call them contractions. I'm having contractions. That's what's going on often is women are having really strong spasms in their
often,
stomach.
but then of course, often people just dismiss the pains of birth.
All
So
right, yeah, fair. Yeah, fair.
there you go. I think all I'm
Which is unimaginable, having done it twice now. It
yeah.
is not like you say, I'm dealing with a spinal injury, severe pain. I'm on morphine, all of that stuff, and yet nothing compares to the indescribable feeling of giving birth. It hurts
But
in
it's
big letters. It
I
hurts.
think I mean, I really just put all of this up to say that number one, I think half the population at least are not aware of the fact that pain is a normal state of being. It's seen as an abnormal state of being by them that can and should be avoided, whereas women see it as an unavoidable.
It's
Well,
just part of life. It's part of
yeah,
life.
and I would say,
Yeah.
trans women do as well, because trans women go through an awful lot in terms of
Yeah.
physical pain as well as mental suffering. It's part and parcel of being a woman is to suffer pain. But take it in a different context, and then it's something that mustn't take place at all. And you think, could you not just start with helping these young women whose education is being interrupted? Could you not look at these older women whose lives are being completely derailed, including very often their ability to have children, because nobody's taking any notice of their fibroids and other conditions.
Yeah.
So it all becomes very, very woolly when you try to sort of unpack, well, what are you as a rational? And for me, living in North Wales, 3 out of our 4 MPs voted for this, which I just find devastating, because I have to think, well, what do you think of me?
Mm?
What do you think of my life? I think as disabled people, I mean, I used to just, in my 20s, I used a walking stick. And I've lost count of the people since then who've said to me, complete strangers, haven't been striking up a conversation, you just casually sit on a bus and they go, if I were you, I'd kill myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, my goddaughter, her mother was very often sitting in a medical appointment with her, and they'd say in front of the young person, why didn't you have an abortion?
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's no awareness of what we go through. And as a disabled person, are you then more likely to opt for assisted suicide because you've been continually told, you're a burden, a
From the
normal
minute you were
person?
born, yeah, and
Yeah,
before you were born.
the rational thing to do would be to kill yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And in the 25 years since I acquired a brain injury, I've done an awful lot. In the however many decades since I've been in constant pain, I've achieved an awful lot. you know but I've always had voices in the background, real people
Yeah.
don't even know me, saying, why don't you kill yourself? None of these are going to be considered by the parliamentary committee. I
Mm.
think it's so important, not just not just for ourselves and our community, but 250,000 people died under the Nazis just for being disabled, not for any other reason. And what the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust say on their website is we have almost no stories of them. We know very little about, and they sort of make,
Didn't know who they were.
yeah, they make the point, they have great big life stories for other victims, many other victims. But most of those disabled people, they have nobody to remember them but us. They have nobody to speak for
Yeah.
them but
Because,
us.
like you say, their own families didn't know what had happened. Their own families
Well,
put
exactly. And
even
when,
children on the bus thinking they were going to be helped,
and I
and
think,
they never came back, you
but I
know?
think it's not just that. I think after the war, quite rightly, it was felt very important to document every Jewish person who'd suffered, but it wasn't seen as, many of the gay men stayed in prison. The Roma, not seen as important. People of color, not seen as important. Disabled people, oh, well, maybe it was a blessing. No,
Mm. And sterilisation continued.
the time when people could have been researched, but it wasn't seen as important. And I think 80 years after the liberation of Auschwitz, it beholds us as senior leaders of disabled people to say, we remember you. We remember you. We remember what led up to your deaths. We remember what's happened since your deaths. And we will, however inconvenient for other people, keep talking about it.
Well,
But thank you, Dennis. And we're going to finish with a couple of songs. And I thought perhaps you could just introduce them before we swap over and you pick up your guitar.
so I'm going to play a fantastic track by Johnny Crescendo called "Not Dead Yet," which talks about some of these concepts that we've mentioned today, and some of the prejudices that people have about us in a kind of quirky and sometimes funny way. So I really appreciate that song, and thanks to Johnny Crescendo for letting me play it today.
Johnny Crescendo is still very much with us. And this is a song that I think dates back quite some time to perhaps some of the beginnings of the UK disabled people's movement in the 80s and 90s. I always think that there's a genre of disabled people's music that's very much folk music. And in a way, I think it's really sad that the folk world haven't recognized that there's this whole tradition of disabled people's protest songs and songs about our history that are absolutely a key part of the British folk music scene and aren't seen as such. But I think what I always think when you play Johnny's song is that this is just like the folk world, isn't it? Certain songs, even in somebody's lifetime, become greater than they are and
They do.
really speak on behalf of a movement. And what's your other song, Dennis?
The second song I'm going to play is called "For Justice with Love." Some of my friends call it "Pull Together" because that's how the chorus starts. And the reason that I'm including that one today is because it touches on some of these subjects around eugenics, but it also is a song about our history and how we tell stories, so that as we go into the future and as activists in the future are joining us, that they know about these traditions that we now have, and where we've come from. I guess I know it sounds like a cliche, but that's what that song's about, and about remembering the people who've come before us, and why, because a lot of this activism, that's why I do bioethics related activism, actually because of my experience becoming a mother and giving birth and being pregnant. So all of these subjects are really connected together. So yeah, that song is tries to encapsulate that a little bit, I hope.
Well, thank you for that, Dennis, and thank you for joining me today. And Thank you to everybody who's been listening to this podcast. I think it's a really appropriate way to finish with these songs. So over to you, Dennis.
So this is Not Dead Yet by Johnny Crescendo. I'm reading tabloids of fear and passion round a funeral pyre. My social worker says I qualify if I expire. The insurance man is hedging his bets. My family's gathering around my bed. Lying at the gates of heaven, I'm not dead yet. Doctors coming in with pills like a graveyard junkie. There's a nurse dressed in black who says assisted suicide is funky. My mother and father know what's best. They're gonna kick Joe Egg out of the nest. Lying at the gates of heaven, I'm not dead yet. Artificial life, costly compassion, tube force feeding, audience reaction, quality of life versus life support. Vegetate, vegetative, vegetable, spare your lover. The man in the next bed has got a limp dick. He says if I can't masturbate, get me a hat saying kill me quick. His sexual perversion is killing me. He's gotta get a grip of responsibility. Lying at the gates of heaven, I'm not dead yet. The pearly gates are ramped, I know I've just been there. I was kind of amazed to see St. Peter roll up in a wheelchair, yeah. I said, hey Pete, I wanna go back. He said, go and give shit to Dr. Quack. I'm lying at the gates of heaven, I'm not dead yet. I'm not dead yet. I'm not dead yet. I'm not dead yet. I'm lying at the gates of heaven. I'm lying at the gates of heaven. Lying at the gates of heaven, but I'm not dead yet. Fabulous Johnny Crescendo. And here for you now is For Justice with Love. Long live our movement while we must fight. Long may we resist what is wrong for what's right, till all our descendants can live in the light, not locked behind doors, out of range, out of sight. No, the cause of oppression's not inside me or you, our bodies or minds or our senses, it's not true. Let's fight for change till the world is for you, for me, and for all who come after us too. All now, pull together, find those who are missing, so that we may grow. Even now, it's just the beginning. We've come so far, yet there's further to go. Let our Our shared experiences generate change. Leave nothing undone, fight in all of our ways. Leave no one behind, use well all of our days, till we pass over and go to our graves. Times once again are becoming so tough. These social distances feel pretty rough. The carnage our people face is more than enough. But we'll rise again soon for justice with love. All now, pull together, find those who are missing, so that we may grow. Even now, it's just the beginning. We've come so far, yet there's further to go. Hold on to your dreams of a bigger new world, where we all are seen, we are felt, we are heard. Leave nothing undone, fight in all of our ways. Leave no one behind, use well all of our days. Remember activists gone before us, powerful traditions entrusted to us. Tell radical stories so no knowledge is lost. Our emancipation still waiting for us. All now, pull together, find those who are missing, so that we may grow. Even now, it's just the beginning. We've come so far, yet there's further to go. We've come so far, yet there's further to